Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A world apart. Ava Monroe stepped into the luxury of the first-class cabin, her presence commanding attention as effortlessly as a lighthouse draws the eye on a foggy night. Dressed in a tailored white blouse and a slate-gray blazer, she moved with a grace and confidence that made the space seem smaller, less grand in her wake. Her natural curls framed her face, and her dark, expressive eyes hinted at both resilience and an intelligence sharpened by years of relentless determination. At 42, Ava was not just a woman who had climbed the ladder, she had built her own. The hum of the plane's engines underscored the soft chatter of passengers settling into their seats. The atmosphere was a mix of muted luxury and purposeful energy, typical of a first-class cabin populated by CEOs, dignitaries, and moguls. Yet Ava noticed, as she always did, the subtle shifts in energy when she walked into spaces like this, spaces where she was often the only black woman, and certainly one of the few who had earned her place through sheer grit. Sliding her custom-made leather handbag into the overhead compartment, she took her seat by the window. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though she owned not just the seat but the entire cabin. From her bag, she retrieved a sleek tablet, a fountain pen, and a small notebook embossed with her initials, AM. She adjusted her seatbelt and began writing a list of tasks, ideas, and strategies for her next venture. To Ava, every moment was an opportunity, even the quiet moments before takeoff. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a navy suit peeked over his newspaper, his gaze lingering on Ava longer than was polite. He whispered something to the woman beside him, who glanced quickly in Ava's direction before returning to her phone. Ava was used to it, the curious stares, the silent judgments, and the thinly veiled assumptions. They didn't anger her anymore. If anything, they fueled her determination. Her attention shifted when a woman in her late 40s, wearing a neatly pressed flight attendant's uniform, approached her. Miranda Hargrove carried herself with the air of someone who had seen it all in her 20 years of service. Her blonde hair was tied into a tight bun, and her uniform was spotless, but her smile didn't reach her eyes as she addressed Ava. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Miranda said, her voice crisp. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava looked up, surprised but unfazed. She placed her pen down and pulled out her phone to display the e-ticket. Miranda scanned the screen quickly, her brows furrowing slightly before she handed the phone back. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, her tone professional but clipped. Ava gave her a polite nod, her focus already drifting back to her notebook. Miranda, however, lingered a moment longer, her eyes scanning Ava as if trying to place her in some mental category. As Miranda walked away, her thoughts churned. Something about Ava unsettled her, not her behavior, which had been nothing but respectful, nor her appearance, which exuded class and elegance. It was something unspoken, an implicit sense that Ava didn't fit the mold of the first-class passengers Miranda had served for decades. Ava wasn't loud or demanding like some of the other travelers who wore their wealth like armor. She was self-assured but understated, and for reasons Miranda couldn't articulate, that bothered her. Back in her seat, Ava could feel the weight of the attendant's lingering glance, but she dismissed it. She was here for peace, not drama. She returned her focus to her notebook, where she was drafting ideas for her upcoming philanthropy project, a scholarship fund for underprivileged girls in STEM. It was personal for her. She had been one of those girls once, struggling against systemic barriers and low expectations. Her success wasn't just for her, it was a beacon for others who dreamed of breaking free. The plane filled steadily, and soon the first-class cabin was nearly full. Ava noticed a young woman being guided to her seat near the front, her face lighting up as she settled in. Ava smiled faintly, it reminded her of the first time she'd flown first class, overwhelmed by the sheer luxury of it all. But the moment of nostalgia was interrupted when Miranda returned. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Miranda said, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "It appears there's been a mistake with your seat assignment. I'll need you to move to the back of the plane." Ava blinked, her pen hovering over the page. "Excuse me," she said, her tone calm but firm. There's been an error, Miranda continued, her words deliberate. This seat was double booked, and we've assigned it to another passenger. Ava's eyes narrowed slightly as she straightened in her seat. I booked this seat weeks ago, and my ticket clearly confirms that. Perhaps there's been a mistake, but it's not mine. Miranda hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly. I understand, ma'am, but I'll need you to cooperate. We can find you a seat in economy. The cabin grew quieter as heads turned toward the exchange. Ava could feel the eyes on her, the curiosity and judgment thick in the air. But she wasn't about to be intimidated. With all due respect, Ava said, her voice steady but unmistakably assertive, I'm not moving. I paid for this seat, and I'm staying in it. Miranda's professional facade began to crack. She glanced around, as if hoping for support from another crew member or even a passenger, but none came. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have to involve the captain, Miranda said, her voice lowering but no less firm. Ava leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. Please do, she said simply. Miranda turned sharply on her heel and disappeared toward the cockpit, leaving behind a silence that buzzed with unspoken tension. Ava exhaled slowly, her mind already racing through the possible outcomes. She wasn't just fighting for a seat, she was fighting against the kind of systemic bias she had encountered her entire life. A few rows back, a passenger whispered to their neighbor, she's not backing down. Good for her. Another replied, yeah, but do you think she'll win? They usually just kick people off. Ava didn't care what they thought. This wasn't just about her comfort, it was about principle. She had spent her life defying expectations and breaking barriers. If Miranda Hargrove thought she was about to become an exception, she was sorely mistaken. As the minutes ticked by, Ava remained composed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She wasn't here to cause a scene, but she also wasn't about to let anyone undermine her dignity. Little did she know, the events unfolding in this cabin were about to set off a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond this flight. The ripple begins. The hum of the aircraft engines felt louder now as silence enveloped the first-class cabin. Passengers glanced nervously at one another, uncertain whether they should speak up or stay silent. Ava Monroe sat quietly, her back straight, her composure unshaken, but her eyes burned with a fire born of years of experience, years of battling invisible walls that sought to keep her out. Ava knew this moment wasn't just about her first-class seat. This was about perception, power, and prejudice. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let anyone challenge her rightful place. And though the situation remained calm for now, she could sense the tension tightening around her like a coil. Miranda Hargrove returned moments later, her face tight and her steps hurried, accompanied by another crew member, a tall, wiry man with salt and pepper hair. His uniform identified him as David Marks, the senior purser on the flight. He approached Ava's seat, his expression rehearsed into a professional neutrality that barely masked his discomfort. Ms. Monroe, David began, his voice low and conciliatory, I understand there may have been a misunderstanding. However, we'd appreciate your cooperation in resolving this matter quickly. Ava folded her hands in her lap, lifting her chin. Misunderstanding, she repeated calmly. My ticket clearly states this is my seat. There's nothing to resolve. David's lips pressed into a thin line. I assure you, Ms. Monroe, we're simply trying to accommodate all our passengers. Another passenger claims to have this seat. Then I'd suggest you check your system again, Ava replied smoothly. I purchased this seat weeks ago, and my reservation hasn't changed. Miranda, standing slightly behind David, bristled visibly. She crossed her arms, her impatience evident. Ava caught the quick flicker of annoyance in Miranda's eyes, the way her gaze seemed to sweep over Ava like she was an anomaly to be corrected. David exhaled, his tone softening. Ms. Monroe, if you don't comply, we'll have to escalate this further. Ava met his gaze unflinchingly. Then escalate it. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged furtive glances. A man seated a few rows back muttered, "This is ridiculous. Just let her sit there." Another passenger, a woman in her 60s, frowned and whispered, "Why are they targeting her? I don't see anyone else being asked to move." Miranda's face reddened at the growing unease in the cabin. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Ms. Monroe, I must insist. And I must insist that you respect my rights as a paying passenger," Ava shot back, her voice firm but never rising. "Would you ask someone else to give up their seat in the same situation? Or is it just me?" The accusation hung in the air, like a thundercloud. Miranda stiffened, her mouth opening to protest, but David put a hand on her arm, signaling her to step back. He could see where this was going, and he knew the optics were dangerous. Every set of eyes in the first-class cabin was now fixed on the three of them, waiting to see what would happen next. "Excuse me," a voice interjected from behind. Ava turned slightly to see a younger woman, perhaps in her late 20s, standing in the aisle. She wore business attire, her expression polite but clearly frustrated. "I think I'm the passenger they're talking about," the woman said. "They told me I had this seat, but," she trailed off, looking apologetically at Ava. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Ava studied her for a moment, then turned her gaze back to David. "There you have it," Ava said. "It's your error, not mine. So, how do you intend to resolve this?" David hesitated. Before he could finish, a man in the third row cleared his throat loudly. He wore an expensive suit and had the air of someone accustomed to wielding authority. "This is absurd," he said. "It's clear this woman booked the seat. If there's an issue, it's the airline's fault, not hers. Let her stay and fix it later." A soft chorus of agreement rose from other passengers. Ava could see Miranda's face flush with frustration, her control of the situation slipping away. David sighed and pulled Miranda aside for a quiet, hurried conversation. Ava remained poised, her eyes focused ahead as she listened to the hushed exchange. "Do you see what's happening?" Miranda whispered sharply. "They're siding with her. We're losing control." David's voice was lower, more measured. "Because this isn't right, Miranda. She booked the seat, and now this has turned into a spectacle." "I don't like her attitude," Miranda snapped. "She's—" "Enough," David interrupted sharply. "You're letting this get personal." Miranda opened her mouth to argue, but David had already turned back to Ava. He approached her with an expression of forced calm, as though trying to repair the damage Miranda had caused. "Ms. Monroe," he said, "I apologize for the inconvenience. It appears there was a mistake in our system. Please enjoy your seat." Ava's gaze didn't waver. "Thank you." As David walked away, Miranda lingered for just a moment longer, her face tight with resentment. Ava looked up, meeting her gaze with a calm strength that made Miranda's discomfort all the more obvious. Without another word, Miranda turned and walked toward the galley, her heels clicking sharply on the carpeted floor. The cabin slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the air still buzzed with a quiet tension. Passengers exchanged glances, some approving, others embarrassed on behalf of the crew. Ava could feel their eyes, but she no longer cared. Her dignity was intact, and she had made her point. Behind the curtain. In the galley, Miranda leaned against the counter, her face flushed and her hands shaking slightly. "I don't understand," she muttered. She was so smug. David gave her a sharp look. "Miranda, you're out of line. This is going to end up in a report, you know that?" Miranda turned away, mumbling under her breath. "I just don't get why everyone's siding with her." David shook his head. "Because she didn't do anything wrong." Miranda fell silent, chewing on his words as resentment roiled in her chest. The ripple spreads. Meanwhile, Ava settled back into her seat, pulling her notebook onto her lap once more. She had hoped for a quiet flight, but now she could feel the currents of change around her. A woman across the aisle gave her a small, encouraging nod. A man behind her leaned forward and said quietly, "Good for you. You handled that perfectly." Ava smiled faintly and turned back to her writing. The incident wasn't over, not yet. What had begun as a minor humiliation would soon become much more than a momentary standoff in a first-class cabin. Somewhere, someone had recorded the exchange on their phone. Social media posts were being drafted, and whispers were starting to spread. Unbeknownst to Ava, the small battle she had just fought was about to send ripples far beyond this plane, into the very fabric of the airline industry itself. By the time the flight landed, the storm that was brewing would explode, and the world would know her name. The ripples had begun. And Ava Monroe was just getting started. Storm in the clouds. Ava Monroe leaned back in her seat, the tension in the cabin slowly dissipating as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. She could feel the hum of the engines vibrating beneath her feet, but the real buzz was coming from the people around her. Despite the airline staff's attempt to smooth over the incident, Ava knew this was not the end of it. Moments like these had a way of growing into something much larger. She turned to her notebook, forcing her focus back to the words on the page. A strategic mind like Ava's never wasted an opportunity. While most would stew in anger or embarrassment, she was already drafting notes for her legal team, documenting the incident, and planning next steps. Ava believed in taking control of situations, even when the odds seemed against her. That mindset had built her empire. As the plane climbed into the clouds, Ava sensed eyes lingering on her, subtle glances, a mix of curiosity and quiet support. She looked up and noticed a man across the aisle discreetly holding his phone. He was recording. Their earlier interaction must have drawn attention, and Ava couldn't blame him. She knew her calm but firm stand had struck a chord. The cabin might have returned to routine, but stories like this didn't simply disappear. The tension behind the curtain. Meanwhile, in the galley at the back of the first-class cabin, Miranda Hargrove stood fuming. She slammed a tray of water bottles onto the counter, the noise startling another flight attendant. David Marks, still reeling from the earlier encounter, walked in and gave her a long, measured look. "Miranda," David said quietly, "you need to let this go." "Let it go?" Miranda snapped, turning sharply. She turned the entire cabin against me. I've been a senior attendant on these flights for years, David. I know when someone doesn't belong. David frowned. And what exactly makes her not belong, Miranda? Miranda hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as the answer hovered on the edge of her thoughts. She didn't have the words, or perhaps she didn't want to voice them out loud. David shook his head. You know what I see? A paying customer who handled herself with far more dignity than you did. You crossed a line today, and you need to reflect on that. Miranda's jaw clenched, her face flushed with embarrassment and resentment. I don't understand why this is such a big deal. David gave her a pointed look. It's going to become one. I can feel it. Turbulence of a different kind. Hours passed, and the flight settled into quiet monotony. Passengers were absorbed in their movies, meals, or laptops, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the incident still lingered like smoke in the air. At one point, as Ava sipped her water, a flight attendant, this one younger, with an empathetic demeanor, approached. Her name tag read Sarah, and her expression was a blend of caution and warmth. Ms. Monroe, Sarah began softly, kneeling slightly to meet Ava's eye. Level, I just wanted to apologize for earlier. That shouldn't have happened. Ava looked at her carefully, assessing whether the sentiment was genuine. Thank you, Sarah, she said calmly. I appreciate that. Sarah nodded, her voice quieter. For what it's worth, we're all aware of who you are. I follow the Monroe Initiative, you've changed so many lives. It's inspiring. Ava's brow lifted slightly. The Monroe Initiative was her foundation, an organization that provided educational opportunities and mentorship to marginalized communities worldwide. Hearing this acknowledgement here, in the same space where she'd been treated so dismissively, struck a bittersweet chord. Thank you, Ava said again, her tone softening. It's always nice to know the work is making an impact. Sarah smiled faintly and stood up. I'll let you get back to your writing. As Sarah walked away, Ava let her gaze wander back to the window. The vast, endless clouds stretched across the horizon, their serenity a stark contrast to the storm brewing below. Ground Zero. By the time the flight touched down, Ava had put the incident to the back of her mind, determined not to let it weigh on her. She gathered her belongings, moving with the same grace and poise as before, and stepped into the jet bridge. Passengers streamed past her, some nodding or whispering quiet words of support as they walked by. "Good for you," murmured a woman in her 60s, clutching her designer bag. "We need more people like you." "Thank you," Ava replied with a small smile, though her thoughts remained focused ahead. As Ava reached the terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen, trending alert, flight incident raises questions of bias in airlines. Her breath hitched slightly as she opened the article. There, right on the screen, was a still image of Miranda and David standing over Ava's seat, captured from a passenger's phone. The caption beneath read, "First class controversy, Black executive challenges airline's treatment of passengers." Ava exhaled, shaking her head faintly. Of course. She knew the virality of the internet could amplify small moments into national debates, and that's exactly what was happening now. Within minutes, she received a text from her assistant, Leah. "Leah, have you seen the video? It's everywhere. CNN, Twitter, everything. Call me when you land." Ava typed back quickly. "Just landed. Heading out now. Let's prepare a statement. The world reacts." Within hours, the video of the flight incident had gone viral. The clip, less than 90 seconds long, showed Miranda insisting Ava leave her seat, while Ava calmly refused. The focus was sharp on Miranda's thinly veiled frustration and Ava's composed yet assertive responses. Across platforms, hashtags trended. Hashtag dignity in the skies. Hashtag justice for Ava Monroe. Hashtag bias in the airline industry. Social media erupted in heated debates. Some praised Ava for her grace under pressure. Ava Monroe handled that so perfectly, respectful, calm, and strong. We need more role models like her. How many times does this happen to people who don't have her platform? Makes you wonder. Others criticized the airline's actions, pointing to systemic bias in the treatment of minority passengers. This isn't an isolated incident. Airlines need to do better. Discrimination like this happens daily. In the corporate offices of the airline's headquarters, executives scrambled to address the growing PR nightmare. Lawyers reviewed policies, communication teams drafted statements, and the airline CEO was already being pushed to make a public apology. Ava takes control. Back in her hotel suite, Ava sat at the edge of her bed, phone in hand, reading headlines as the story snowballed. Her assistant, Leah, paced across the room, holding a laptop. "They want you on Good Morning America," Leah said, scrolling through emails. "And NBC, and basically every outlet." Ava sighed. "Let them wait." Leah paused, looking at Ava. "You're not angry? This could have been so much worse." "I've been here before, Leah," Ava replied softly. "Different setting, same fight. This isn't just about me. It's about all the people who face these battles every day but don't have the voice or the platform to push back." Leah nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Ava stood, pulling her blazer back on. "Let's set the record straight. We'll speak our truth, and then we'll push for change." As Ava strode to the desk where her laptop sat waiting, Leah smiled faintly. She knew this wasn't just another PR moment, this was the beginning of something bigger. Ava Monroe wasn't just going to win the battle, she was about to change the entire system. And the storm was only beginning. Voices rising. Ava Monroe stood in front of a large window in her luxurious hotel suite, the skyline glittering in the twilight outside. The weight of the previous day lingered heavily on her shoulders, but she carried it like she carried everything else, gracefully, with a determined resolve. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the desk behind her, lighting up with calls, messages, and media notifications. News outlets were running her story nonstop. Social media was on fire. The Ava Monroe incident, as some headlines had dubbed it, was no longer just about a seat in first class, it had become a symbol of something much bigger. Her assistant, Leah, walked briskly into the room, a tablet in hand. "Ava, you're trending globally. This isn't slowing down. The video's at 4 million views and counting. Activists are rallying behind you, influencers are sharing your story, and the airline stock dropped 7% in the last hour." Ava turned from the window, her brow lifting slightly. "They'll try to patch this with an apology soon enough." "They already did," Leah replied, swiping the screen to pull up the airline's official statement. She read aloud, "We sincerely regret the unfortunate misunderstanding that occurred aboard Flight 272. We are committed to ensuring all passengers feel welcomed and valued, and we will conduct a thorough review of our policies." Ava's lips twitched into a humorless smile. "A misunderstanding? That's rich." Leah set the tablet down and met Ava's gaze, her expression serious. "You're handling this better than most people would. But what's the next move?" "They want you on Good Morning America tomorrow. You'll have the whole nation watching." Ava didn't answer immediately. She sat down in the sleek chair by the desk, flipping open her notebook. The list she'd written mid-flight stared back at her, a mix of goals, plans, and action items. She tapped her pen against the page thoughtfully before speaking. "This isn't about a television interview or a headline. It's about showing the world what's really at stake here," Ava said. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened, Leah. It's just the first time it's happened to someone with a platform loud enough to be heard." Leah sat across from her, nodding. "So, what are you thinking?" Ava exhaled deeply, a glint of steely resolve in her gaze. "I'm going to turn this into an opportunity. If the airline wants to avoid a PR nightmare, they're going to have to sit at the table with me and make real changes." The fire spread. By morning, Ava Monroe's name dominated the news cycle. On TV screens across the country, anchors dissected the incident with fervor. Footage from the airplane cabin played on repeat, a calm, dignified Ava refusing to back down while Miranda's frustration festered on her face. Analysts debated the deeper implications of the event, from systemic biases in service industries to the expectations placed on Black women who dared to occupy spaces where they were not supposed to exist. In homes, offices, and cafes across the country, people watched and reacted. In a bustling diner in Atlanta, a group of women huddled around a phone, shaking their heads. "She's a role model, you know?" Stood her ground and never lost her cool. In a New York office, a Black executive watched the news coverage with tears in her eyes. "We've all been there in one way or another. She just had the courage to fight back." On social media, the conversation raged louder than ever. People shared their own stories of being underestimated, humiliated, or overlooked. Others called for accountability, demanding the airline take real action. The hashtags #JusticeForAvaMonroe and #BiasInTheSkies remained at the top of Twitter trends, with millions of posts pouring in every hour. Ava's calm defiance had sparked something powerful, a collective reckoning that people couldn't ignore. The meeting that changed everything. That afternoon, Ava sat in a sleek boardroom overlooking the city skyline. Across from her sat the airline's CEO, an older white man with graying hair and a look of forced humility on his face. Next to him sat a panel of lawyers and PR advisors, their notebooks open, pens poised, waiting to negotiate. Ava didn't bring a lawyer. She didn't need one. Her voice was enough. "Ms. Monroe," the CEO began, his voice measured and diplomatic, "first, allow me to offer my deepest apologies for the unacceptable experience you endured on our flight." Ava nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology, but words aren't enough. This is bigger than me, Mr. Whitaker." The CEO blinked, caught off guard by the directness in her tone. "Of course," he said quickly. "We're committed to improving our diversity and inclusion training for staff. I assure you." Ava held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Training is a start, but it's not the solution. Bias like this runs deeper than a few workshops. It's systemic, and it requires systemic changes. What do you propose? One of the lawyers interjected, trying to steer the conversation. Ava leaned forward, her eyes sharp and determined. I want you to partner with organizations that specialize in combating bias and discrimination, real experts. I want your hiring practices reviewed to ensure you're prioritizing diversity at every level of your company. And I want transparency, public reporting on your progress, so the world can hold you accountable. The CEO exchanged glances with his team, clearly uncomfortable. Ms. Monroe, those are ambitious requests. Necessary requests, Ava corrected. And I'm not asking. I'm telling you what it will take to rebuild trust, not just with me, but with every person who has been mistreated, ignored, or silenced. The room fell silent. The weight of Ava's words hung in the air, like a challenge no one dared to refuse. Finally, the CEO exhaled and nodded. We'll consider your proposals. Ava smiled faintly, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. I'll be waiting for your answer. The voice of change. By evening, Ava was seated across from the host of Good Morning America, her calm demeanor unchanged, despite the whirlwind of attention surrounding her. Cameras rolled, and millions of viewers tuned in. The host leaned forward. Ava, the video of your experience has struck a chord with people all over the world. Why do you think this moment resonated so deeply? Ava clasped her hands, her voice steady and measured. Because this isn't just about one flight attendant or one passenger. It's about the way society treats people who don't fit its narrow expectations of who deserves respect. That video isn't just my story, it's the story of countless people who have been told, in one way or another, that they don't belong. The host nodded. What do you hope comes from all of this? Ava's eyes burned with quiet intensity. I hope this moment inspires change, real change. I want companies to look at their policies, their training, their culture, and ask hard questions. I want people to examine their biases, whether conscious or not. And I want every little girl or boy who looks like me to know that they belong in every room, every space, no matter who tries to tell them otherwise. The audience erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the studio. Ava smiled softly, knowing this was only the beginning. A movement born. Within days, the airline issued a public commitment to overhaul its diversity practices and implement third-party audits. Other airlines began following suit, acknowledging the need to address similar issues in their organizations. Activists and advocacy groups rallied behind Ava's call for systemic accountability, turning the incident into a catalyst for larger conversations about equity, dignity, and respect. Ava Monroe didn't just fight for a seat, she fought for a movement. As Ava returned to her work, her phone buzzed again. A message flashed on the screen. Thank you for standing up. You've changed more lives than you know. Ava smiled faintly as she looked out the window, the sun setting over the city skyline. This fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the tide was turning. And Ava Monroe would make sure it never turned back again. Legacy in motion. The weeks that followed Ava Monroe's confrontation with the airline unfolded like chapters in a history book being written in real time. What began as a single incident, a moment of humiliation at 40,000 feet, had ignited a movement that no one could have predicted. From newsrooms to boardrooms, classrooms to living rooms, Ava Monroe's name had become synonymous with justice, dignity, and change. Her calm defiance wasn't just praised, it became a rallying cry. People of all races and backgrounds shared stories of their own struggles, of times they were told they didn't belong or had their worth questioned. The incident had opened a door that could no longer be closed. Bias, long whispered about in hushed tones, had been dragged into the light for the world to see. The shift in the skies. 1 month later, Ava sat in the corner office of Monroe Enterprises, the city skyline sprawling in the distance. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm light across her spacious office. Her desk was clutter-free, save for a stack of papers, a steaming cup of green tea, and her ever-present notebook. The same notebook she had carried on to that fateful flight now rested beside her, its pages filled with the plans that had turned chaos into opportunity. Leah entered the office, tablet in hand, her expression animated. "You're not going to believe this," she began, unable to suppress a grin. Ava looked up, arching a brow. "What is it?" Leah sat across from her, swiping at the screen. "The airline just released their diversity report. They've already started implementing the changes you proposed. Third-party reviews, mandatory bias training for all employees, and a scholarship program for marginalized youth pursuing careers in aviation." Ava's smile was faint but triumphant. "Good. That's a start. There's more," Leah added. "Other major airlines are following suit. They're scrambling to update their policies, and some have reached out to collaborate with organizations fighting systemic inequality." Ava set down her pen, her gaze drifting momentarily to the skyline outside. The weight of what she had accomplished wasn't lost on her. "It's about time," she said softly. Leah grinned. "You know you've become a hero, right? People are calling this the Ava effect. You're everywhere, news outlets, podcasts, think pieces. Even Time wants to feature you as one of their People of the Year." Ava laughed lightly, shaking her head. "A hero? I just did what anyone should do, demand respect." "But not everyone does," Leah replied. "That's what makes you different. An invitation to inspire." A few days later, Ava found herself walking onto a brightly lit stage, to a standing ovation. She had been invited as the keynote speaker for a major leadership conference, where business leaders, activists, and young professionals had gathered to hear her story. The crowd, diverse and eager, buzzed with anticipation. Dressed in a midnight blue suit, Ava exuded her usual elegance and calm. She approached the podium, her natural curls framing her face as she smiled warmly. When the applause faded, Ava began to speak. "Thank you," she said, her voice resonating through the room. "When I boarded that flight weeks ago, I had no idea I would be here today, standing in front of you all. I didn't ask to become the face of change. I didn't plan for my name to trend on social media or for news outlets to dissect my story. All I did was stand up for what was right, and that, my friends, is something each of us has the power to do." The audience hung on her every word as she continued. "For too long, we've accepted certain behaviors as normal. We've been told to stay quiet, to pick our battles, and to not make waves. But what I've learned is that silence is not peace. Compliance is not respect. And when we accept less than we deserve, we reinforce the systems that hold us back." She paused, scanning the crowd. "I didn't stand up for myself just for the sake of my dignity. I stood up for the young black girl sitting in her classroom right now, wondering if she'll ever be seen or heard. I stood up for the woman who's afraid to take a seat at the table because she doesn't think it's meant for her. I stood up for the countless people who face invisible battles every single day." The audience erupted into applause, but Ava raised a hand to quiet them, her tone growing softer yet more powerful. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of one person alone. Change happens when each of us refuses to settle, when we speak up, when we show up, and when we demand better." Her final words rang like a bell through the auditorium. So ask yourselves, what seat have you been told isn't yours? What room have you been made to feel unwelcome in? And what are you going to do to claim the space you deserve? The audience rose to their feet, applause thundering like a wave. Tears glistened in the eyes of some, while others cheered and shouted their support. Ava stepped back from the podium, her heart steady, her resolve unwavering. Ripples across the world. In the days and weeks that followed, Ava's speech went viral. Her words inspired movements, conversations, and debates far beyond the airline industry. People began sharing their own stories under hashtags like #ClaimYourSeat and #DemandRespect, flooding social media with voices that had long been silenced. Companies across sectors announced internal audits and new diversity initiatives, acknowledging the urgent need to address systemic inequities. Meanwhile, Ava's Monroe Initiative experienced a surge in donations and partnerships, allowing her foundation to expand its programs. Scholarships for marginalized students in STEM, mentorship for young women, and entrepreneurial grants for minority-owned businesses flourished under her leadership. One particularly poignant moment came weeks later when Ava received an email from a young girl in a small town in Mississippi. It read, "Dear Ms. Monroe, my name is Jasmine, and I watched your story on TV with my mom. I want to be a pilot one day, but everyone tells me that girls like me don't become pilots. When I saw you, I felt like maybe I can do it. Thank you for showing me that I belong anywhere I dream of being." Ava read the message twice, her heart swelling with emotion. It was a reminder of why she did what she did, why she fought battles, both big and small. The journey continues. Months later, as Ava boarded another flight, this time to attend the opening of a Monroe Initiative program in Ghana, she noticed a shift. The smiles from the flight attendants felt more genuine, the energy in the cabin more welcoming. She settled into her seat, her presence calm and confident as always. A young woman in uniform stopped beside her. "Ms. Monroe," she said softly, her face bright with admiration. "It's an honor to have you on board. I'm training to be a flight captain, and I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done." Ava smiled warmly, extending a hand. "Keep pushing. The skies are yours." As the engines roared to life and the plane began its ascent, Ava gazed out the window at the endless expanse of clouds stretching before her. She had won a battle, yes, but the journey for justice, dignity, and change was far from over. There would always be new skies to conquer, new battles to fight, and new voices to lift. And Ava Monroe, the woman who refused to be silenced, was ready for whatever came next. The legacy was in motion, and it would soar far beyond the clouds. This was just the beginning.